A trans-identifying biological male out of the Seattle area decided to take himself out of the gene pool earlier in March after getting in a shootout with law enforcement who were trying to serve an eviction notice. Unsurprisingly, in the wake of this self-deletion, you have activist journalists and, of course, like the local Antifa enthusiasts, basically trying to blame everybody, except for the individual who decided to start a shootout with law enforcement and then, turn the weapon on himself thereafter. My name is Greg Hoyt. We're going to go ahead and dive into this story here on The Breakdown. Hey, this is Greg Hoyt from The Breakdown. If you're new here and checking out the channel on YouTube, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Also, feel free to follow me on Twitter at GregHoytLET. Anyway, let's get on to the video. On the morning of March 20th, 3 Kings County Sheriff's detectives arrived at an apartment building in Seattle's Ballard neighborhood in an effort to serve an eviction notice to 29-year-old Nathaniel Stolzig, who is a biological male who apparently, transitioned or identified as a woman and has been going by the name Eustace for, a number of years. Now, for those who aren't familiar with the eviction process, especially at the point where law enforcement gets involved, it is not uncommon for local law enforcement to get their hands in, a serving of an eviction notice. With said involvement of law enforcement usually taking place well after a time period has elapsed where all other legal efforts to evict a tenant have taken place and the individual just hasn't willingly vacated the property. And when law enforcement gets involved in these types of eviction notices, they're primarily there for 2 reasons. Number 1, to keep the peace, make sure no funny business happens, and ultimately ensure that the eviction is carried out. Now, for the sake of context, when it comes to this Nathaniel character being evicted, according to local court records out of King County, he was originally served his eviction back in September of 2022. So we're talking about 6-7 months ago. So we're dealing with an individual who basically rode out the eviction process and, tried to stay on the property as long as he could without paying any rent, because apparently when he was evicted in September of 2022, he'd already accumulated approximately $6,300 worth of unpaid rent. That being said, the 3 Kings County Sheriff's Department detectives, identified as Detectives Easterly, Wheeler, and Miller, arrived at the property just before 9:30 a.m. on March 20th to get the eviction, rolling, to get this individual out of the apartment. However, this attempted serving of an eviction by the 3 sheriff's detectives was hardly run-of-the-mill, because when they went to go serve the aforesaid eviction, Nathaniel Stolzig reportedly opened fire on the 3 detectives, and a shootout played out. Reportedly, the 3 detectives returned fire on Stolzig, with the individual reportedly barricading himself inside of the apartment. Now, during the exchanged gunfire between Stolzig and the 3 detectives, Detective Easterly was reportedly shot in the upper torso, and local reports note that Detective Easterly is still in critical but stable condition after getting shot in the torso. As for Nathaniel Stolzig, it's unclear if any of the return fire by the detectives actually struck him, because again, he went into his apartment and barricaded himself in after a brief exchange of fire. Now, needless to say, there was an additional response by law enforcement with respect to the gunfire that broke out between Nathaniel Stolzig and law enforcement, and also because, additional first responders needed to hit the scene because he had an officer down who was shot in the torso. After roughly about 2 hours since the onset of the initial confrontation, law enforcement wound up breaching the apartment that Nathaniel Stolzig had, holed himself up in. And lo and behold, by the time officers got inside there, they already found the individual deceased. Following an autopsy performed on Stolzig, the local medical examiner's report read that it appears that Nathaniel Stolzig turned the weapon on himself and decided to remove himself from the gene pool. Now, according to news outlet The Post-Millennial, Stolzig was a member of the Democratic Socialists of America who signed a letter during the 2020 BLM Antifa riots that rocked Seattle, calling for then-Mayor Jenny Durkin to resign because she didn't support the riots enough. Well, imagine my shock. We are talking about a biological male who identifies as transgender out of Seattle that just so happens to be associated with the Democratic Socialists of America and is in cahoots with the whole BLM Antifa enthusiasts of the area. I mean, when you take all that into consideration, it really isn't that shocking to learn that this individual, decided to start a shootout with police because he couldn't handle the eviction that he brought on himself for not paying the rent. Unsurprisingly, the Democratic Socialists of America issued a statement on March 21st, blaming the fact that Stoljes died as a result of facing the inherently violent and traumatic process of deputies forcibly evicting a person from their home, while conveniently downplaying Stoljes not paying his rent ostensibly for months before being notified of his eviction last September, and then continuing to reside in the apartment for an additional 6 to 7 months after knowing he was going to eventually face a forced eviction. In the portion of the statement from the Democratic Socialists of America where Stoljes' non-payment of rent was addressed, the excuse rendered was that Stoljes couldn't hold down a job because he suffered a nondescript workplace injury. Don't get me wrong, losing a job sucks. I get it. But you know what most people do when they lose a job and they really want or need money? They go out and they get another job as quickly as they can, typically. I mean, this person ostensibly hadn't been working for how long? 6, 7 months? Or at least that was when the first eviction notice was given to him back in last September. So that means arguably he hadn't been working for several months prior to. And, obviously this nondescript injury, maybe it could be serious. But I have a hard time believing that somebody is incapable of working for that period of time while also having the strength and stamina to physically barricade themselves in an apartment, because apparently this individual used wood and metal panels and what have you to barricade himself inside of that apartment during the shootout incident. So call me crazy. If you can barricade yourself in a building, something tells me you can do some kind of work. Now, funnily enough, in the statement that was rendered by the Democratic Socialists of America, nowhere in that statement, which decided to blame everything else except for Stoljes, in that statement, nowhere was it said that any of his comrades, that's an obvious joke, were helping him out with any kind of rent money, or at the very least, offering the dude a couch that he could crash on since he was facing a looming eviction. I mean, for a socialist outfit that boldly claims housing is a human right in the very released statement on the matter, it seems like they'll likely assert this mantra, but not actually believe it, because they're probably secretly thinking or muttering under their breath, yeah, they deserve a place to live, just not my house. Now, in terms of local reporting on the matter, a Seattle-based journalist by the name of Liliana Fowler, which she is an NPR journalist that reportedly covers, social justice, she kind of did some very light reporting on this. And by light reporting, I really mean just heavily omitting some facts about the case, particularly the part where Nathaniel Stoljes opened fire on law enforcement and shot one of the deputies before he self-deleted himself. NPR journalist Liliana Fowler took to Twitter with a brief audio clip of one of Stoljes' friends talking about him and captioned the post again with a complete omission of Stoljes shooting the sheriff's detective. The same was done by Fowler in 2 follow-up posts, referencing the Democratic Socialist of America's issue statement in one and a seemingly virtue-signaling post about self-deletion prevention. Now, when Fowler was called out for this really shoddy reporting of omitting a critical detail about this incident, Fowler decided to justify the blatant omission by playing dumb and claiming that investigators have no idea who shot the detective during the incident. Again, an incident and a shootout that was started by Nathaniel Stoljes. This particular incident coming out of Seattle, involving the individual that it does, and the manner in which it was reported by local outlets and activists and statements released by, the socialists of the area, is a prime example of both the irresponsibility and nefarious motivations of activist journalists out of the Seattle area, and also as well as, the social justice warriors who will take, an incident like this, and they'll go ahead and ball it up, craft it into a narrative, and make sure that who they want to be the victim in the story has zero accountability in the entire matter, despite the fact that, in this case, this Nathaniel Stoljes guy, he created the entire scenario. He didn't pay his rent. He resided in the unit for months on end after being evicted, and it appears, based upon the facts of the case, he he decided to start a shootout with law enforcement who were just there to get him out of the apartment that he should have left back in September of last year. But again, I also cannot stress this enough. This case and this incident is also indicative of the fact that these socialist types of people, these democratic socialists of America, these social justice warriors, they will cry and they'll bemoan their comrades' passings in circumstances like these, but it seemed like nobody was stepping up to the plate to offer this dude a place to live. Like, they wouldn't give him a couch to crash on or anything like that. And that seems kind of crazy. At least in my case, it makes me wonder, like, A, how insufferable does this Nathaniel Sturgis character have to be for nobody to want him at their house? Or B, how crummy are your friends or acquaintances or, network that you associate with? How crummy are those people that they'll be like, man, it kind of sucks you're getting evicted. Oh well. I don't know. Call me crazy. I know in my lifetime, heck, in the past couple of years, on a few occasions, I've had friends and family members stay at my house, for weeks, even months in certain cases, if they were dealing with any kind of housing issue, whatever the circumstances may have been. I mean, more often than not, if you're generally a decent person and you have some decent friends of, moderate means, most people will find a couch for you to stay on. So either this Sturgis character, again, he was either very insufferable, or B, his friends sucked. Anyways, guys, that's pretty much the long and short of it. Go ahead and drop your comments below as to what you think about this particular case, because I'm curious to know whether or not you agree with my take, you kind of have your own position on it, or whether you completely disagree. Whatever your take on the matter is, drop the comment below. Let's see what you think of this whole incident. Anyways, guys, that was the breakdown. Peace.